stand in this corner. Yeah.
Or stand straight in the center of the aisle, and then you get the surround sound. Up to you.
I've done that in the middle. I've always done opposite.
Up to you.
Because there are people here that can hum a lot louder. I mean, that's what hasn't ensued.
But that's actually intentional with the humming and Pete's on consensus and humming, because you get a sense not just of everything, but how strongly people feel. So if I don't care that much, I might go, and so it does. Yeah. So if you have advice for us, let me know. Yeah. So don't be afraid to say, what about hands or something if you think that we're in that case.
Yeah, so it's good to have your feedback.
When we get, because it's not a working group yet, and so technically this is all the information for you as the recipient to make a decision, right? I will look to you to provide advice on whether you have sufficient information on the clarity of the group. So if this is a working group, then I wouldn't do that, but for the BOF, I would. Because it's your call, right? But you got to listen to them and decide if you have enough information based on the community to make your decision. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so it's 1:31, so as soon as Nancy comes back, we'll have people sit down.
I will save you as many seats as I take your file. You can count on it. You can. That sounds all sufficient ambiguity into that.
Yep.
I want you guys to know I don't think I'm going to be there late. Okay. So I could probably make time.
I see some people still coming in. We'll start in a couple minutes here. Since this is right after lunch, we don't have to start right on time, but we would like to start shortly. So if you can find a seat.
Who do you work for now? What's that say? R? What's R? Is that a university? Yeah. I already got someone's. Oh, is it really? Cool. Have you been there long? Have you been there long?
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the TEEP BOF. Nancy and I are the chairs. Since this is a BOF, our area director is sitting here in the front row. This is a working group forming BOF, and so we would like to have some discussion on scoping and charter and so on. So this is covered by the usual note well. You've probably seen this many times this week. If you haven't, please read it. But among other things, if you're actually talking about some technology, which really this is about what should be in a charter or what a working group should do. But if you're talking about technology and you know of IPR, then you should tell us. Okay. We do have, I believe, 2 note takers and a Jabber scribe signed up. Nancy?
Yes, so I want to thank Barry and Dave Waltermeyer. Hopefully you're here now.
Yep.
As note takers, and Yoav, you're all set for the Jabber? Perfect. Thank you.
For anybody else, we are using the Etherpad. There's links to the Etherpad in multiple places. You can find it on the IETF agenda page, a link to it there. You can find it in the agenda page. You can find it in the welcome slides. It shouldn't be hard to find the Etherpad. All right, so this is our agenda. So we wanted to spend about roughly the first third of the meeting on the problem statement, right? This is not the first BOF. We had a BOF a while back, and although there was a lot of interest, maybe at most half of the room actually understood the problem that was 2 IETFs ago. So we've had a bunch of work on understanding the problem. And so we wanted to make sure we all understand the problem. And then we'll move into discussion of what should it be, what should a potential working group do should our AD choose to charter us. And so that will be the remainder of the meeting. And so what you will not see on there is solution proposals, right? There are active solution proposals that are being discussed on the list and so on, but the purpose of this meeting isn't to focus on the actual solution proposals. We would do that in future meetings, interim meetings, inside the working group if it gets chartered, and so on. Okay. Any other questions on the agenda? Okay, just making sure you're not coming to the mic. All right. Now I need to switch slides to go to the problem statement slides then.
Yeah.
Which is problem statement there. Okay, so the draft authors and proponents have elected me as the person to give the problem statement summary. So this is actually a collaborative set of slides between a number of authors and people from multiple companies and groups and organizations. So back 2 IETFs ago, there was a little bit of discussion on the problem statement, and last IETF we had a meeting which was to focus on what the problem statement was and have some charter text. I thought it was a very productive side meeting at last IETF. And so based on that, there was a draft that was written that contains some of that information that's there. And so I'm going to talk to you kind of what the community has said so far as to what the problem statement is. Okay. So the focus of this is trusted execution environments and provisioning applications into them. So background is that there's a general realization in many parts of the industry that hardware-based security is desirable. So for example, different processor technologies from different companies and organizations have various types of isolation concepts. Okay? So many of those are well-known concepts. Among them is this concept that there is this notion of a rich execution environment, that what you might think of as being a classic, application environment, alongside a trusted execution environment where the code is somehow more secure, and I'll talk about that in a slide in a second or so. This notion of trusted execution environments is already widely deployed in the payment industry. Right? So many of you might have in your pocket something that has a trusted execution environment in some definition, which is chip and pin cards. The little chip that's on there is an example of something that you can consider a trusted execution environment. Okay. So this notion of trusted execution environments is already widely adopted in the payment industry, but is not widely adopted outside the payment industry. And so we're trying to broaden the applicability and say, how would this be applicable to things in general? And we'll talk about the use cases. Okay. Also, there's various other standards bodies that have said, yep, we're going to build technology or solutions or policies or evangelization around the notion of trusted execution environments. Okay. But inside the IETF, historically, we haven't yet, to my knowledge, have things specific to trusted execution environments. So what is a trusted execution environment? So because there exist multiple flavors and vendors in the TU, sort of what do we mean that would be in scope for here? Well, a trusted execution environment generally meets the following 3 characteristics. And anything that meets these 3 characteristics could be called a trusted execution environment and be in scope for the discussion here. Okay. So the first one is that the device has some unique security identity. So for example, it might have a private key that's like stored in some place that can't be extracted, so you can't clone that device, for example. That's an example. Second property is that any code that runs inside the trusted part is hardware verified to be that code, right? Not some malware, not some buffer overrun injected code, really the code that it thinks it is. So the hardware enforces that, okay? That's a requirement to be called a trusted execution environment for these purposes. And the third property is that any of the data, whether that's data like storage or whether it's memory of the running trusted application, is protected so that it can't be read, at least in an unencrypted form, if at all, from code that's outside of that, right? So the code is the code that you think it is, and any memory or storage accessed by that is only accessible by the trusted side, okay? Anything that meets those 3 is a trusted execution environment. As I mentioned, there are trusted execution environments from multiple vendors and various variations of it that kind of meet those 3 criteria. So that's kind of the common thread of when we say trusted execution environment provisioning, this is the trusted execution environment, and we'll talk in a second about what you're actually provisioning. So if you got a question about that, I'll come back to what you're provisioning.
Eric Nordmark,
Yep.
clarifying question. Yep. So if there's multiple applications running in the TE, is there some assumption about there's some isolation between them or not?
I think for purposes of this discussion, the answer is yes, we assume that you want isolation Now, if, for example, you only have one application that can be possibly provisioned because it's a IoT device or something like that, then isolation might not be a strict requirement in all scenarios. But I think the notion of isolation between things that are two different things that are both trusted, isolating them from each other, is in scope, because you'll see the actual use cases actually do, at least some of them do use that.
Howdy. So one thing I noticed you didn't say that is a feature of like TrustZone but not of SGX is that like TrustZone is basically a hypervisor with respect to the normal code. So for the purpose of this discussion, we are not assuming that not assuming that's part of the property.
You talked a bit fast, but if it's not on here, then I'm assuming that it is not necessarily a property that applies to all TEEs. And right. The scope of here is a wide variety of flavors of TEE, all of which are interesting in different use cases.
Yeah, great. Well, the property I'm talking about is that TrustZone is basically a hypervisor for the real world, right? And that's not true in SGX. So we're not assuming that that's part of the game.
Correct, because the point of this is how do you get code into the trusted execution environment? What that code is responsible for doing is somewhat orthogonal, other than it might be a use case, right?
Yeah.
But it's not the scope.
Thank you.
Okay. This is one example that just shows that there's been work in other SCOs. This example comes from the Global Platform spec, and Global Platform does things in the payment industry. It does things for secure elements and so on. But this example is just showing you have, in this example, there's two different worlds. The left side is called the rich execution environment, which is normal applications and things, and the right side is the trusted execution environment, or the trusted applications, or trusted parts of applications. And often they need to communicate with each other across some internal API. By internal, I mean not necessarily a protocol that goes off box, right? Okay. So this is an example architecture that's commonly cited in the payment industry and so on, where TEEs are widely deployed today. But a similar architecture will apply to any other type of TE, right? So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it is really hard to write a trusted application today. Okay? Lots of people write normal applications, and you put them up into various app stores and distribute them and so on. And by comparison, that is easy compared to what it takes to write a trusted application today. Okay? And so the problem here is, how do we make that be easier in a way that is interoperable? Okay, I'll give a little detail in a second here. So there's three example use cases that have been discussed on the list. I think the draft currently covers two of them, but there's three use cases here. The first one is sort of payment applications. And so a classic example would be, I have something on, say, my phone, like a tap-to-pay type of scenario, that there's a trusted part that's installed into a trusted execution environment on the phone, and that's the thing that has access to authorize payments and take care of my payment stuff. So that's one example, and that was a use case that was described in the first BOF. Second one is for IoT. Okay, so the first one is protecting finances. The second one is protecting, say, things that might be life-threatening or safety-critical, or other definitions of IoT, right? The ability to actually turn on and off motors in a chemical factory, or vehicle, traffic lights and things like that, right? That control of safety-critical operations, putting those into a trusted execution environment can improve the security. So the second one is, how do I get the code into an IoT device that might have some danger associated with it in a trusted way? That's the second use case. The third use case has to do with, both of the first two are about devices I can either see or touch or whatever. The third use case is a cloud use case. Okay, so today you have a cloud hoster, and you have services that run in that cloud that might be managed by an organization other than the cloud hoster. So for example, the cloud hoster might be Microsoft Azure or AWS or what have you, and somebody else wants to run their service in that in a way that the cloud hoster can't compromise or even see that data, right? So if I want to run an application, let's say it's controlling my gadgets, it's an IoT scenario, right? How can you run that in the cloud and install that in the cloud in a way that the cloud hoster can't just come along and tweak data, or get an order from a particular government to say, hey, please hand over this person's data or this company's data, or please, shut down the following motor here, and you're not allowed to tell them. Okay, so that's kind of a use case that says the trusted execution environment in the cloud is one that the cloud hoster has no visibility into, because the cloud hoster works like the normal world on the left side. Okay, And so the separation here between two different entities, one that is highly trusted and one that is perhaps less trusted, or in this example, run by a different organization that you don't want to have access to the stronger security stuff. Okay, so that's the third use case. This is the picture that we put on our BOF poster, and you find right outside the door now, that just shows a number of entities. And so this was some of the work that was done since the first BOF to try to make this be clear. So there's two primary entities, and then there's some facilitating entities. The primary entities on the far left side is the organization that creates an application that has a trusted component. Maybe the whole thing is trusted, but at least the trusted application. So the app developer, or the trusted app developer. On the far right side is the entity that manages the device into which that trusted application is going to be installed. So it's the guy that runs the IoT device, runs the IoT device, or that has the payment system on the phone, or wants to be the cloud service customer to put stuff in there. So that's what we call here the end user. Maybe that's not the right term because the term varies by use case, right? But sort of the thing that wants to have the application be installed. The facilitating entities, right, on the top, there might be some CAs that are in use depending on the solution. Okay. There might be one or more that different entities might have different CAs, and so that's kind of hand-wavy there because that varies by solution. But then on the bottom is the main part that we'll get to, which is this notion of a trusted app manager. Okay. So the trusted app manager in this example here is trusted by both the app developer and the end user. Now, who can actually run one of these trusted app managers may vary by use case, but we'll give you a couple of examples. One is that it could be a trusted third party. That's one of the cases that says, okay, both of them trust a common, maybe it's a security firm or somebody that's a security provider that manages things that could be contracted. So there's a business model there for people that want to do that. Another example where the end user might be a large enterprise is the trusted application manager might be run by the end user's IT organization themselves or somebody that they contract with. Okay. There might be other variations too, but this notion is that the trusted application manager is a thing that's involved with establishing the trust and keys and permissions for that application to be installed into that particular end device. Okay. So this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, showing the process of how things get there. So at the very beginning, right, the application developer creates an application. That application might have two components. Or maybe it depends on somebody else's component, right? So you have the trusted component and an untrusted component. The untrusted component gets installed however it gets installed today, right? That's kind of the upper horizontal path there, the 2A to 3, right? Goes to an app store, whatever the mechanism is, okay? How do you get the trusted application there? There's two possible paths, okay? The trusted application might be bundled with the untrusted application, meaning the actual bits of it, okay, might be bundled with it, okay, and then it follows the bits of the trusted part follow that same path, or it could follow a separate path, which is labeled as 2B there, okay. Now, so whether the trusted application manager is involved just with the metadata and security exchange, or whether he's actually ferrying the literal bits, okay, varies by what the use case is or the solution stuff, okay, and we're not going to dive into that, but the point is the trusted application manager's main job is to facilitate the security exchange, and how do I verify that this application is trusted to run in that particular device. Okay, that's his job. He might also have a secondary role of being able to ferry the trusted application bits itself or not. Okay, that's not his role. It might be something that it also does because of efficiency or whatever else. Okay, that's what this slide is trying to convey. The bottom part of this actually bleeds into what we'll talk about a little bit later, which is the relationship of suit and TEEP. So those of you that were in suit, you see the bottom of this talks about firmware, right? And if you look at the stack in the middle and the big one, you can see firmware underneath trusted applications. And the focus of this BOF was on the trusted applications part. The focus of suit was on the firmware part, which is about 2 layers down from there, okay? And so out of the different entities we've talked about, right, the device owner and the app developer and so on, there's a number of questions that are what is difficult today that the mechanisms that this proposed group would define are trying to resolve those questions, right? So the app developer thinks about, so which TEs or firmware is this application supposed to run on, right? Do I trust those? Is it running on a valid one, or is it supposed to run on something that's a knockoff TE or whatever? How do I update my applications over time? The device owner, on the other hand, the device owner admin, on the other hand, is thinking about, well, which developers or applications do I actually want to allow apps to be run inside this trusted environment, right? Which apps do I accept? Which ones should be rejected, and so on. So those are policy decisions, okay? And so that's what this mechanism that such a group would do, are trying to answer those questions, because that's the part that is actually really hard today. So this one is just summarizing. I think I've covered most of the things on this slide now. So the applications have to be provisioned somehow. How do you get the code into there? How do you get the code into there sort of physically? How do you get the permissions to do that and get appropriate signature so that that code is allowed to run? Okay, because remember, one of the definitions of the TEE is that the only code that can run in there is code that it believes is trusted and is the actual code. So how do you establish that? Right, that's the sort of the metadata exchange and provisioning aspect. That's the core part of the mechanisms that we're talking about. The trusted application manager, okay, one of the desires is to be able to create, I'll just go back to this, this slide. One of the desires is to be able to allow creation of a trusted application manager that works with a variety of TEEs and devices, TEE flavors and devices on the far right side, right? And so the interoperability point is that I might have one TAM that's managing applications in a variety of different end-user devices, right? I might have some using, say, ARM processors, some using Intel processors, whatever it is. I want to use a common TAM to do that as, say, an enterprise admin or as a security provider. Okay, and so that's why there's an interoperability issue, because the TEE vendors, the problem is in common across them, and they want this to be a common mechanism so that you can have this common trusted application manager. Okay. And so today you have lack of standards that do that. And so that's the goal of bringing it to the IETF to say, hey, we got all the right participants, we think, in the IETF that do TEE vendors and security providers and so on across the different use cases. Okay. So that's the goal, to develop or at least the proposed goal, to develop a standardized protocol for providing and managing trusted applications in various devices that have TEEs. Okay. I think I already mentioned allowing a TAM to work with multiple TEE and device vendors and flavors, right? Even from the same vendor, there's sort of a spectrum of different types of TEEs. Okay. Okay. Just making sure there's no questions there. Okay. Questions on the problem statement, because at this point, because remember at the end of the first BOF, right, which is before a lot of this work was done, the question was, we don't understand the problem. Or I should say 40% of the room said, we understand the problem and we want to do work on it. And 60% of the room said, we don't understand the problem. So what I'm presenting now is all the work that was done since then to say, do you think you understand the problem, or at least a problem, that you can now, when we get to the charter part, you have an idea of what you think the charter ought to say. For scoping. Okay, so problem statement, clarifying questions. Go ahead.
So I think having the different use cases helps illustrate this, and what I'm thinking about in the back of my head is, so what is the case? What happens when you run multiple of these applications? And I think that there's a piece missing in the description, because if I have multiple applications that can run in the TEE, yeah, you could label that they're trusted, but one is controlling my bank account and one my pacemaker, right?
Yep. Yep.
Or the motor or whatever. Yep. So that piece about you really are authorizing them to get some particular access or capabilities or whatever. And in the third case, I think the authorization is not really about, you really are just trying to isolate them. So you're just authorizing them that you can run here, but you're not getting any special access. That's my current sort of thinking about this.
Correct. So in your first case, right, where you have, banking and IoT running on the same device, like, a phone or a box that's sitting in your house or whatever, yes, you want isolation in between those. And by isolation, that means the data that's used by one of them, whether it's data at rest or data in running memory or whatever, is isolated from the other one, right? That your banking process can't control your lights, and your lighting process can't touch your bank account. Okay, and the TEEs that we're talking about here are all ones that provide isolation for anything that allows multiple trusted applications in the same platform, that it provides isolation between them. So yeah, you're right. That could be a stronger point in the use cases and problem statement.
But it's also that, something that what can turn on and off the valve, right? That might only be one of them, right?
Right. So what you're pointing out,
access to some IO or whatever form it takes.
Right. So I agree with you. So if I go back to this picture here, okay. I'm just going to echo what I'm hearing from you. So this is the global platform picture, and I don't know if I have, okay, I do. right here is a little box that's labeled as trusted peripherals. Okay. So an example of what you're talking about is what are the permissions that you're giving to an application running inside here? Okay. If I have a set of trusted peripherals, does this particular trusted application have access to which set of trusted peripherals? Right. So if you're saying, so a banking application, it might be none of those, or maybe it's my fingerprint reader to allow authorization or whatever, but not my lights on a different bus or whatever. Okay, so your point is to be able to manage the permissions of access to, in this example, trusted peripherals is something you'd be looking for, and I agree.
All right, Kyle Rose. What assumptions are we making about the hardware and what it provides in terms of isolation, right? So there's one of the problems with some of these TEs, I'll just use SSJX because that's the one I'm most familiar with, is there's considerable evidence that there's no way to achieve complete isolation between processes running on the same silicon, right? So for instance, if you had a trusted execution environment that was performing key signing with a private key, and you had some other trusted execution environment for a totally different application, it could use a side channel to determine the bits of that private key, right? So I think in order for this to be useful, there have to be some properties that we can assume about the environment. What are we assuming? And if nothing, then what are we trying to get out of this? Okay, so I will take, okay, Hannes, you're specifically responding to that? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, hi, this is Hannes. I work for ARM. There are different trusted execution technologies, and they have different properties. And like so many other computing systems, none of them is perfect. The question is, should that prevent us from doing something? Specifically nowadays, if you have caching side channel attacks, they tend to be somewhat severe and very difficult to deal with. And pretty much all the architectures, unless they don't have a cache, are impacted. And of course, you can deal with or provide some mitigation techniques, like you were able to, or we are able to provide mitigation techniques for side channel attacks, let's say, against power consumption. But you have to take care of them and specifically address them. So you still, even though you have those technologies, you still have to pay attention to many of these attacks. How much you worry about them depends a little bit on your scenario, whether you have multiple apps running on this environment, and in many other factors. So, but yeah. I wouldn't, like, for example, from a history of hardware, we've seen more and more isolation techniques being introduced over time. So when you think back about the old MS-DOS days, every app and operating system, everything was running in a single space, very similar to how many IoT devices work today. And so in isolation techniques like the memory management unit, hypervisors were introduced to actually provide better security. So are they perfect? No. Do they improve security? I think so.
So I'm going to try to give a short summary of that the primary motivation, but not the only one, right? The primary motivation is to be able to get an application into a trusted execution environment so that it can't be messed with by the normal world. Okay. As long as you're doing that too, then there's this case, well, what if you have two of them? Then you have this isolation between them. That's great to handle too, and subject to policy of, can it be perfect? Maybe in some cases, yes, maybe in some cases, no, okay? But you still have to do the provisioning, even if you only allow one of them, and that's the primary motivation for this, is how do I get the first one in there? But a lot of these actually, so in other words, how do I protect it from things running the outside world? By outside, I mean the normal world, yeah. Right, so another example, like even if you're just talking about a single trusted execution environment, is the memory that is being used for the trusted execution environment integrity protected or not, right? Right. And there are different technologies. Some are integrity protected and some aren't. And so you can twiddle bits if you have sufficient access. Correct. Say, like ring -2 access or something like that. In my definition here, I have defined a TEE by wording in the third one as being, if you don't provide the memory protection, it's not called a TEE for purposes of this slide. Well, what do you mean by memory protection? that something in the normal world can't peek into that memory and see what it is.
Those are different things, right? Being able to peek into the memory and read it is very different from being able to poke into the memory and change a bit, even if you don't know what the effect is going to be.
Sorry, either one, right? That the normal world shouldn't be able to poke in and change a bit either.
Okay, so you're saying, you're assuming something about the memory controller that walls off normal access.
Because then this is a statement about protection from the normal world. Okay, whether there's side channel attacks between them or whatever doesn't invalidate the use case for the first one. It's something to be discussed in the actual mechanisms to say how good can you do there, what are you assuming, and so on are all valid questions, right? The motivation for this is protection from the normal world, and that is a part of a protection that should be discussed, right? And again, people may disagree with my definition, but you see, my definition is I've defined that as not being a trusted execution environment by my definition.
Marc Blanchet, can you go to the goal slide?
Okay, right after Mark, we will have David. You're right after David. You're right after Mark.
Managing, does that mean software updates?
That is a question I would like to defer until we get to the relationship between suit and TEEP slide.
Right.
Which we have that discussion here.
Okay, because we don't want to have like a protocol to provision here and then another protocol somewhere else that does the updates, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Got that covered on later slides, but not in the problem statement. That's in the charter scoping discussion. Yeah.
All right, should we go to
so David is next.
Yeah, my name is Dave Wheeler from Intel. I think going back to discussing about the characteristics of TEEs is important. The thing that I didn't hear come up was the idea of attestation. So a TEE should be able to attest to its identity, which gives you an understanding of what type of TEE you're dealing with. And then you can understand as a service provider or a user of that TEE what those characteristics are. Is integrity provided? What is the strength of side channel attacks, and so forth? So then a service provider can use the attestation to then decide whether they want to allow their application to run inside the TEE. And one of the key aspects of OTRP is being able to get a list of what things are actually running in the TEE. So based upon what's running and what type of TEE it is, a service provider can make a policy decision saying, well, there's these other applications running. This isn't as strong a TEE as I'd like, so I'm not going to run my application. And I think those two parts of OTRP are important, the ability to attest to the TEE and the ability to know what else is running in the TEE so you can make those decisions. That's it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So about the previous questions about how strong of a protection you provide against isolation, whatever, at least the point here is that it would be, I'm taking David, your point is that it is important to be able to allow a TEE to securely attest to what it is so that you can have policies based on what the state is to say, I want to allow or disallow based on how strong it is or other variations, right?
Okay, Subir Das. I downloaded the slide. I think your presentations and this slide, there was one slide which actually says that background software details, which tells that trusted peripherals, public peripherals, and which is missing here. The reason I'm mentioning this one, not this one. So you mentioned about the goal, a standardized interface, right? So my specific
I didn't say that was a goal. What I said was that the goal was to have the line that is labeled number 4 on this diagram, which is the protocol between the device TEE thing and the trusted application manager. Right, that's the one that is squarely in the proposal.
Right. So
everything else is background and use case.
Yes, but your last slide says that define a standardized protocol for providing and managing trusted application. Right.
Yep.
So
that was line 4.
My specific question is that this standardized interface is running on the trusted peripherals or the shared peripherals or the normal peripherals?
I think you're going down into details of the solution. This is the use case.
Right, but
I'll give you my opinion if you need it, right?
Right. No, I'm just trying to understand
group,
that right? when we are running a protocol like standard interface, what exactly the goal would be, where to run.
The goal is to have a solution that meets this goal in a secure fashion. I have an opinion as to what that implies as to answer to your question. But I believe that your question is actually part of the solution, not part of the scoping, right? But the scoping is we want this to be done securely.
Okay.
Yes, I'm hoping you can guess at what my answer would be. But
no, I think it is there. No, I was just trying to understand that where this interface on the device will actually run, right? Meaning is that in the protocol.
You're asking a question about solution space. This is not a solution space discussion right now.
Okay, that's fine.
So
I think it's a great discussion. I would love to have a working group to actually cover that in detail.
So you mentioned before that there should be no difference between reading the memory and modifying. I think it could be a big difference because it depends on the application. For example, if you have a pacemaker and you modify it, you can kill a person, or if you have a self-driving car and you change it. Yep. So I think we should differentiate and we have two separate cases, in my opinion, because they address different needs.
Yep, I agree. To David Wheeler's point, that's really a requirement around what is being attested to. And so the impact on here is to have visibility from the policy engine and visibility in the policies to be able to control that, right? Yep. Other than that, a statement that says you must do this or you must do that is not the purpose of this. This is to be able to express policies and decide whether to run code and to be able to give it the right permissions if it's permitted.
Okay.
Yep. Sorry. State your name again. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Hank?
Yeah. Hi. This is Hank. So I'm a little bit confused, but that might be because I'm a little bit tired. The thing I hear is that the most important thing to attest to just parrot that term, is the identity of the TEE. So you somehow provide evidence that an identity is tied to the computer integrity. No.
That is one of them. Whether you think that's the most important or not is a value statement.
So yeah, because then again I heard integrity. Yep. So you want to attest to the integrity of the contents of the TEE also. The integrity referred to the memory that is volatile or that is block device.
Yeah, there are other mechanisms in other bodies, Global Platform and TCG and so on, that do is sort of what you can attest to.
Yeah.
I think David's point, and I forget the name of the person or whoever it was that was asking about the isolation incident, is to say whatever the protocol is for configuring policies and putting protocols in there needs to have visibility into that same information. Whatever it is that it's attested to in those other mechanisms, this needs visibility into that. Okay. I think that was the main point, is that we're not trying to say what you're attesting to, because there's other bodies that do that. But if other people are attesting to things, we want to be able to express policies and be aware of that in the application, installation, and management protocol.
Yeah, I still don't know how policies match into this, but what I hear is that the TEE can provide evidence, and you want visibility to that evidence, or you want to have visibility into the appraisal of that evidence.
Sorry, in the visibility, what was the last thing you said? The visibility.
You want to have visible into the evidence that is provided by the TEE, or you want to have visibility into the appraisal of that evidence. Okay, but there's something completely different and way more complex. Okay, so yeah, and the visibility of the appraisal, is it a report or is it a complete verification? Do you want to see the complete verification context or just the
I suspect Ecker is going to comment on that same point. So
again?
Because I suspect the person behind you is going to comment on the same point since he got up when you brought that up. So no? Okay.
I'm just
yeah,
okay. So
I guess my question to the BOF audience is: do people believe that the distinction is in scope for the charter discussion here?
Yeah.
Or is that something that's actually owned by another organization or part of document discussion that this working group might do if it becomes a working group? Okay. Because right now I have a hard time figuring out if it actually impacts a charter.
Yeah. So there's a lot of big pictures here. It can be quite simple if it's just the identity tied to the TE, and it's something completely different, or you want to do the appraisal.
I agree that this is a great discussion. I'm wondering if this is the sort of discussion that should be put into a working group after formed, or if it's something that we have to cover in that BOF part of performing it. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So Ecker?
I'm pretty sure this is a charter question. Okay. So maybe you said this before and I missed it, but this non-lock-in point. So, I mean, obviously my SGX binary went on Truststone and vice versa. So is the idea that as the TAM I would have I'd have one Trustzone binary and one SGX binary, but I'd have a common protocol installed on your machine, no matter which architecture you had.
That's correct.
Okay.
So that you can manage them the same way. And you said one thing, I just want to go back in case you weren't here for that discussion. The actual bits that would be ferried could come through there, or they could come through role 2A, and just the policy might come through 2B. So what you said is true for one of the two possibilities.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. So how do I standardize the mechanism to do the establishment, the metadata, the configuration? The bits themselves can be completely opaque to the TAM. So it might have two versions of it. It could be the two versions of it come through the normal app store, but the policy is going to manage it the same way for both, SGX and Trustzone. Okay. And by the way, I think both ARM and Intel people are vehemently nodding about that. So I see there. Okay.
Yep.
All right. If there's no other question, the problem statement, then I think the next thing on the agenda is to go through the review of the proposed charter text. So that again, we'll go back to the agenda for a second here. But if I remember right, it's Nancy's going to go through the proposed charter text that was as of last IETF meeting, meaning the side meeting that we had there. Then we'll have some scoping discussion, scoping slides about relationship to suit and other things on the list. Okay, and then we'll have just open discussion about to do live editing if necessary of what the charter things is. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Nancy. Yeah, you don't.
All right, so at the side meeting, we had a very good discussion on how we could focus and put a charter forward. So I think what I'll do is just read it in case we don't, just to bring everybody along, basically. And then what we want to do is just have you guys absorb this, and then I'll pass the mic back to David because there's a couple of other things that we want to raise before we actually get into the discussion of the charter and the potential editing if needed, which I'm sure we'll have some. So what we have currently as the proposed charter is the definition of the trusted execution environment, which is it is a secure area of a processor. The TE provides security features such as isolated execution, integrity of trusted applications, along with confidentiality of their assets. So in general terms, the TE offers an execution space that provides a higher level of security than a rich operating system and more functionality than a secure element. So for example, implementations of the TE concept have been developed by ARM as well as Intel using the Trustzone and SGX technology respectively. Okay, so to programmatically install, update, and delete applications running in the TEE, this protocol runs between a service running within the TEE, a relay application or service access point on the device's network stack, and a server-side infrastructure that interacts with and optionally maintains these applications. Some tasks are security sensitive, and the server side requires information about the device characteristics in a form of attestation, and the device side may require information about the server. Okay? Privacy considerations, of course, have to be taken into account, especially with authentication features and attestation. So this working group aims to develop an application layer protocol providing TEEs with the following functionality: the lifecycle management of those trusted applications and the security domain management, as Dave has already described in detail. So a security domain allows a service provider's applications to be isolated so that one security domain cannot be influenced by another unless it exposes an API to allow it. The solution approach must take a wide range of TE and relevant technologies into account and will focus on the use of public key cryptography. So the group will provide the produce the following deliverables. So first, an architecture document describing the involved entities, roles, the relationships, assumptions, and the keying framework and relevant use cases. Secondly, a solution document that describes the above described functionality. The choice of encoding formats will be decided also in the working group. The group may document several attestation technologies, considering the different hardware capabilities, performance, privacy, and operational properties. So as we are talking about different hardware implementations, we need to consider the fact that we will maintain a close relationship with forums like the Global Platform, the Trusted Computing Groups, and other relevant standards groups to ensure that we're making use of, or proper use of, the existing TE relevant application layer interfaces. So I don't think it's time yet to go through the milestones. I think it would be useful for Dave now to continue with the other points that we wanted to go through.
Okay, we will come back to this because after we get through their slides, we'll come back to this and do any markups in here as to if there's phrases in here that are wrong or want to be modified or whatever it is. So first we'll go through sort of the things that have been discussed on the list so far and summarize for anybody that's new to this where they're at. So that's what I'm doing the slides, but don't worry, we'll come right back to this and do some potential live editing. So if you got a clarifying question, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a clarifying question.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
So this is not an area where I have a whole lot of expertise, but so it may be obvious, but I don't see the term audit appear anywhere in here. And I'm wondering whether, when you talk about life cycle and attestation, is that implied that the workflow that you're describing will include the ability to ask these devices, what they have on them, what versions they're running, that sort of thing? Is that an obvious question?
I think that's not a clarifying question about what was already in there. I think that's a suggestion or a question about whether something should be in there. So I've got a note for that. We'll come back to that in the later part.
I thought it was
make sure I don't forget. That's my request to you, but I'd have it as a note on here. So.
Hi, just quick. This is Henk again. I think audit, I think that's true. It refers to attestation of past states. So you have to leave something behind that you can verify, not when it's fresh, but when it's old.
Well,
exactly.
Well, but I think this gets into whether we worded things appropriately or not.
Right.
I think we should defer until we get to the actual charter text.
Yeah, because our goal in this meeting is to figure out what we want the intent of the charter text to be, right? We might be able to do some wordsmithing in the meeting. If we don't, at least if we agree with intent is, we can do the wordsmithing offline. But the goal is to get the feedback from the community to verify that people believe that, it's close enough that we can go to the next step in the chartering process, or, it's close enough scope, and here's what we want the intent to be, and then we can go off and wordsmith or whatever after this meeting. But we'll do what we can during the meeting. Okay. So at least I've got a note also on my screen so I don't forget the audit point. So. Also, hopefully, as Nancy read through that, a couple of you that asked questions, I believe that the charter was clearer than the problem statement slide with respect to one or two of the questions that were raised. So hopefully you noticed that.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's any other things that we need to clarify on the text, we should move. Okay.
Okay, so I'm now going to summarize and see whether there exists a general direction of consensus of a couple of the points that have been being discussed on the list that are sort of scoping questions. Okay, so Nancy just walked through the review of the charter text, so we just did that. So the first one is relationship to suit, and so for those of you who weren't there was a BOF on Monday that was the suit BOF. Dave Waltermeyer and I were the chairs of that one. And you can see there's the link to the charter text, which is the pre-edited version. There's an updated version after that meeting. So suit is software update for the Internet of Things, okay, if you weren't there. One notable outcome, besides the fact that the proposed charter text is being updated to reflect the consensus of those in the meeting, is there was a discussion about whether suit or software update for the Internet of Things was just for Class 1 devices or not. And there was agreement that it is not just for Class 1 devices. The agreement was there's a requirement that things be able to scale down to Class 1, but that's not a restriction. Okay. So this is the variation of the slide that I presented on Monday, just with a couple things reordered. The same information is on here. If you look at the currently proposed charters, meaning what's posted on the data tracker, right, prior to the meetings, you would notice three things if you did a compare and contrast. Okay. The first one is that TEEP focuses on trusted apps meaning things that sort of run after boot that are sort of provisioned separately from, the core, OS or environment, okay? Whereas suit focuses more on firmware, meaning the thing that's used for boot, whether you call it software or firmware or whatever, okay, terminology aside, the thing that's used for boot versus things that are installed and might be running, after boot for specific purposes, okay? So that one was seen in the suit BOF to be kind of the primary division of labor. If you're talking about provisioning stuff that's used as part of the OS or boot or whatever, that's more for suit, okay? If you're talking about how you might be provisioning things that are running post that, then the suit people said that's kind of more for TEEP. At least that was my sense of the root, okay? And so you'll see the question here is this the right one? Do we, as a TEEP community, think that this is the right split, or do we have different opinions? I'm just reporting out that this was kind of the feeling of the room there. And so that one was kind of a division of labor that was kind of a almost disjoint proposal, okay? Here's where you draw the line, okay? There's two other axes that you might look at that are either overlapping or could be overlapping depending on whether we change the language in one or the other. The second one, you'll notice, actually has a little bit of overlap in purpose, okay? So the TEEP proposed charter talks about installation of code into a trusted execution environment, regardless of whether it's for IoT, because that's one of the use cases, but not the only one. Just anytime that you have a trusted execution environment. Suit's focus is on installation of code on an IoT device, whether it has a TEE or not, if you look at the current charter, right? Okay, so that one could be seen as being overlapping if you ignored the first axis, right? Now, I believe the outcome of suit was that as long as there's a division of labor on one axis, then the fact that there's overlaps in the other one is not a big deal, right? Because where you go depends on your answer to the first question. Okay. Finally, the last axis is that the TEEP charter focuses more on initial provisioning of code the first time. Now, when she read through, you did notice the word either update or maintain. I forget which one of those two was in there when she read it, and so hopefully you noticed that. Okay. But the focus was on how do you get it there the first time. Suit, on the other hand, assumes that it's already there and you're trying to update it. It's all about the word updates. The focus is different, but it's not necessarily by way of constraint. The focus is installation of new code into a TE or update of firmware. Okay, so this update versus initial installation is the third axis. You can see there's a little bit of overlap, but primarily the distinction is the first one. Okay. So I want you to think, is this the right split, or is there some, because this is what you get when you read the current data tracker charters, okay? And the question is, what should it say? Is it saying the right thing already, okay? Or should the relationship be different from what the current thing says? Okay, because we want TEEP and suit, should they both be chartered, to be working well together. Go ahead, Hannes.
I think the first axis sort of makes sense to me. The other ones are sort of, I see them more secondary aspect. And sort of in that way, I think there's a possibility for potential reuse of some of the suit work as components or building blocks, but still maintaining a somewhat good balance or difference.
Yep, I have seen people on lists and in meetings and stuff say that reuse of technologies between the two where appropriate would be a good thing. And so, yeah. All right, let's see if we can drain the mic queue, and I will try to not respond to people, so let you respond to each other, and then we'll have comments afterwards. So go ahead.
Marc, I think those lines are pretty blur. For example, what is, firmware, right? Or boot. Actually, a boot sequence may actually have multiple applications being, run one after the other. So which one is the right one? So I think that the line is very blurred between all those, and I'm getting concerned that, two working group will be, doing almost the same thing, but not exactly, and will diverge. So I'm getting concerned that, having two separate working groups is the wrong way. I think we should have only one, which would take over this and then have a specialized version, which is the trusted environment, but the rest will be, all about software upgrades and stuff like that.
Hi, this is Henk again, and I don't want to be disruptive in context to the felt consents in the suit room on Monday. But somehow I had two assumptions. Somehow I thought suit would update my home DSL router. and somehow I had the assumption that TEEP is only about trusted execution environments because it's literally in the name. So somehow I have the feeling that the second bullet point is more point on than the first, but this is only due to this two assumptions I just raised. Maybe my assumptions are totally wrong. So, but if my home router is done by suite and TEEP is done doing trusted execution environment, it's obviously the second bullet point.
Okay, keep moving through the queue. Yep. I could respond to each of these, but I'm not. I want to listen.
Eric, not Mike. So I think that it is a bit muddled, right? Because even the trusted app, as far as I understand it, typically has a trusted, or in many cases has a trusted and an untrusted component.
Yes.
And so it is muddled. And I think that, in an ideal world, the question I'm asking myself is, would we want to have a single sort of manifest schema, whatever, that would cover both, right? Both the firmware as well as the apps, and having some attributes in there that describe what this thing is. And if you do that, well, now you have to coordinate a lot more closely. But it's still an open question in my mind. Right?
Kyle Rose. I want to go a little bit further than Mark and say that there's the second point sort of draws a design space that includes trusted execution environments and update of software on some arbitrarily chosen class of devices. But we're leaving out part of the space that is governed by normal, say, TPMs, right? And that might not be the right design choice here because the overlap between all of these things is very large. And I'm thinking that maybe a better way to divide the design spaces between the provisioning and trust establishment, and then provisioning of whatever it is that you are going to run, which might be a firmware update or a trusted application.
I have a comment to Mark's comment, and I think there's maybe some fuzziness around the term boot. I think that has not to be confused with the boot process that we see on a Windows machine, where you can drag and drop applications, regular applications like MS Word, into your startup folder. This is not the type of boot we are talking about here. Here we talk about, I think that's quite important. Because here we're talking about, even if the boot process happens in multiple stages, so you may have one phase where, if you look at some IoT devices, there's some bootloader that may be in ROM that cannot be updated, followed by a second stage bootloader. But this is a very low level functionality that we are talking about here with the firmware versus all the stuff that follows afterwards. So that's why the notion of apps in a very generic sense, like literally these apps that we've seen on smartphones and the lower level things, I think for me made some sense. Of course, there will always be a fuzziness as technology evolves.
Yeah, Carsten, I agree with Hannes here, but there is still some fuzziness, and maybe we shouldn't just be asking the question what it is, but also what forces pull on it. And if I look at the suit problem, and I start thinking about the TEEP problem, where we have safety and healthcare and regulation and banking and all these considerations, we may get into a situation where what we design is not really suitable for a suit anymore. So I think that is a distinction we also need to make.
Spencer Dawkins, as an individual, Karsten may have been headed this direction, and I apologize if I'm still assimilating what he was saying. But thank you for putting up the slide about the relationship between TEEP and suit. And I understand from the discussions that these number of possible environments where TEEP would run is bigger than the number of environments where suit would run. It was not obvious to me if they had the same constraints on fitting on, say, a class 1 device. Cool. Please.
So I can speak about the Intel technology. Maybe if you want to say something about that. But if you compare, for example, today's trust zone for regular trust zone for A-class devices, there you typically, that smartphone running a Linux-based or Android-based operating system on the normal world. In the secure world, you run a dedicated real-time operating system, for example, by Qualcomm or Trustonic. And so you run two operating systems on the same device. If you compare that to an IoT context, where you actually may not run an operating system at all. So, of course, the class 1 terminology, and this is not the laser pointer class 1 that we had the confusion about in the SUDBOF, but the class 1 from Carsten's RFC, where we have, I don't know, you had it in one of your slides, we have very limited RAM, we have very limited code size, and so clearly there's a substantial difference also in terms of what the silicon is capable of doing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hannes. I was just saying, on the versions of the charter that I've been able to look at, it was not obvious to me that they both, that both of them had to work for class 1 devices. But I don't have an opinion. I'm just saying I'm looking for a statement of whatever it is.
Okay, noted. I think I have a good idea of how to do that, but I want to drain the queue. So.
Minpai from Symantec. Add a comment here. The fourth distinction not mentioned here is actually the volume, scale, and actors. For firmware, most part OEM, you have one device, you want few firmware, one like an OEM update. But I have hundreds of banks want to put a application inside trust security environment to protect my financial transaction. So now the volume scale here is very different firmware versus trusted application. And the second one about who we need to establish verification trust in that sense, right? So most part OEM versus managed service providers, much larger volume. There may be some common part of share, like how to define permission, when the user permit you update my device. Those are under our artifacts, but in high level, it's a very distinct problem to me. So that I support that should be different work group.
Okay. So to summarize what I just heard, since now the queue is drained, I think I've heard that the charter text should be slightly, whatever's in the charter should be slightly more explicit about that. I think I heard a couple people saying, but also what I heard the last people saying was that the type of mechanisms that you'd use for provisioning trusted applications in the context that we've talked about before is a different set of problems and actors, I think was Ming's term, than provisioning something into a class 1 device. And so the focus would be on a larger thing where there is a distinction. There might be some technology that might be reusable by a suit type context. At least that's what I've heard the last 3 speakers saying. So if I got that wrong, let me know. But remember that most of this is really the charter scoping, really the authoritative person is our area director and the ISG, right? And so the purpose of this is to provide the area director sufficient information, and us as chair sufficient information to craft the text to be what will most likely get the ISG to be happy. And so, but ultimately it's their decision, and so we're in listening mode, right? And so that's why I didn't want to interrupt. I'm listening. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm now going to go on to a different topic. Okay. So that was the relationship between TEEP and suit. Another topic on the list was the relationship to global platform. So the history here is that the original, so OTRP is the individual submission that's a protocol solution document that we're not going to discuss the details of, but the point is there is already a document proposed for what to do that has support across multiple vendors and different actors, okay? So that individual draft was authored and then talked about at IETF and the Global Platform organization. At the time, Global Platform passed on working on it. We then had the first non-working group forming BOF back in March. Then we had a side meeting last IETF where we had a lot more clarity, I think, on the problem scope and started working on proposed charter text. And then just last month, only a couple of weeks ago, we got a notice from Global Platform that said they might want to work on this OTRP thing after all. So this is on the public list, and so I've copied 2 of the emails here, or 2 of the snippets here, and I just want to focus on the bolded part, right? You can look at the context or go back to the emails for the full context, right? So Jeremy from Qualcomm reported that there are now significant clarifications and precisions in aspects of security domain behavior and functionality. So in other words, they've taken a derivative work of the original Internet Draft and added clarifications and precisions, which to me sounds like it's not, drastic things. It's like filling in ambiguities and editorial work. Okay. Hank, on behalf of Global Platform, then added this thing that is almost a liaison-y type statement to the IETF, which says the creation of an apparently similar specification IETF will cause market fragmentation and interoperability challenges, right? So this is something that we should be aware of, and so for full visibility, right, this is the IETF community gets to decide what to do with this information, okay? And so that's what generated this discussion, and I'll summarize the subsequent discussion that happened on the list, okay? So first of all, there was a question about, well, this global platform thing is perhaps new to a large portion of the IETF community. And so there were some clarifying questions. Hey, can you tell us a little bit about the global platform process and rules and so on? And so Jeremy explained that the global platform working groups are open only to members who pay the appropriate membership fee. Hank added that they have a public review process towards the end that's where it is public information and anybody can comment on it. Okay, that's just their process. They have a members-only discussion followed by a public comment process. And they believe, or Hank believes, that their version of the OTRP draft would be expected to be in public review in first quarter of 2018, which is actually not that far away, right? Okay. So let's see, we have a number of people some people in this room, most of the authors of the OTRP proposals that are actually members of both groups. So this isn't a case where, stuff was being thrown over, and this is actually a case where there's a significant overlap on the participants, right? At least of the active participants, right? And so this is what they reported, that Global Platform has previously had another mechanism that's called TMF, or TE Management Framework, okay, which is accomplishes some of the same, at least has overlapping use cases, right? It was a different initiative. OTRP is considered to be more lightweight, both by Global Platform and IETF and the authors and everybody else, and emphasized different things. It emphasized the trust establishment. I heard, I don't know if it was Mark or somebody else arguing that the trust establishment is different from, say, the firmware downloading part. Okay, that focused more on the trust establishment part. GP picked up OTRP in August after the IETF BOF process, the first BOF. And they've tried to do a comparison that says, well, here's what OTRP does, and here's what TMF does, and here's what's similar, and here's what's different, and here's what's equivalent, and so on. So they've started working on that, I'm told. And TMF has, I should say, it's overlapping. It's not the same purpose. TMF has more of a TEE state management functions, like not the trusted applications, but the state of the TEE itself. And so this was out of scope of OTRP, which is about a particular trusted app, right? So if I'm managing policies on the TEE separate from policies about a specific application, those are 2 different purposes, right? Okay, so that's just background. So on the list, we said, well, if we charter something in the IETF, we should do so for particular reasons, right? Because there's another organization that said, well, there's this danger of there being 2 different incompatible documentation from different bodies. Okay? So what do we do with that? So this is a summary of the reasons raised on the list for doing stuff in the IETF. Start using OTRP as a starting point was at least the context of the feedback, right? So there's non-technical reasons and technical reasons, right? Because we need collectively to make a decision as a community that says, do we do this or do we not do this? So the non-technical reasons was that there were views expressed that, well, IETF is more open, right? We talked about the definition of openness, like membership, pay-based, and so on. There's the reasons that the belief that IETF provides a broader review during spec development as opposed to at the end of the process, right? Was a non-technical reason that people like doing it in the IETF, among those expressed opinions. And another one was that the IETF culture promotes multiple interoperable implementations as opposed to one or no implementations until the spec is done or whatever else. So IETF has this culture that encourages lots of experimentation and multiple vendors doing experimentation at the same time. So those are the non-technical reasons raised on the list. And then it was interesting, there's been a number of technical reasons raised on the list why IETF might be a better organization for the protocol part. So David Wheeler, who is not in the room, but he's the one that was up there in Jabber. This is a quote from him, which so GP is a different organization that tends to be focused more on an ecosystem of a particular vendor or set of vendors around TEEs and not as broad in terms of TEEs. And so this notion that when doing protocol design, okay, or architecture design, if you're focused too much on one ecosystem, then you might have embedded assumptions in the protocol itself, okay, that would make it less applicable for a more general purpose protocol, right? So I think David's point is what you'd get starting from one point, say coming out of global platform, might be a different thing that you'd get when saying, I would like something that is TEE vendor and flavor agnostic. Okay, and that's a technical point because you develop the protocol and end up with a different state, okay, that's optimized for different things, applicable for different things. The second category of technical discussion is that among the current document that's in the proposed solution space, right, I mentioned that global platform was doing things that fit apparently into the clarifications and filling in ambiguities as opposed to potentially revisiting anything that would drastically affect interoperability. The technical discussions on the IETF list, on the other hand, were things like what's the right encoding format that would allow it to be usable for use cases such as IoT, right? Like CBOR versus JSON, things like that that are out of scope for the BOF here, okay? But the point is that these are the sorts of discussions that the IETF has been having, and you'd end up with a different protocol in order to have these detailed discussions that what the IETF might choose might be different from what's in the individual submission right now, okay? And so that's might result in significant protocol changes or additions to be a general TE protocol. And then lastly, people would like, or various people expressed opinions that they would like to be able to share mechanisms where appropriate between SUIT and TEEP so you don't have competing things. So for example, if SUIT happened to do a manifest format that might be applicable for OTRP or for TEEP in general, then TEEP might choose to use that manifest format. That's just one example. There might be different examples, right? And so this ability to align stuff between SUIT and TEEP is easier to do if the mechanisms are done in the IETF. Okay, so those are the technical reasons that were given. Okay, so see, how are we doing on time?
18 minutes left.
18 minutes left. Okay, then I will skip this one because that's just another discussion about. Well, I'll mention this one in passing. Okay. The IETF typically does not do concrete APIs, and Global Platform does. The current draft contains both a protocol and a concrete API. So one possible, olive branch or way of working together might be, we say, concrete APIs, let the organization that does concrete APIs do that and have us do the protocol is an example of a division of labor. Okay. All right. So what we want input from this community is now you know reasons why another organization might be better and reasons why the IETF might be better. What does this community believe? Because ultimately it's a decision of the IETF community as judged by the IESG. Is should the IETF do work in this area? And if so, in general, what should the charter say that we will or won't do? Okay. The less we say, the more, if a working group gets chartered, the working group gets to decide those things, right? So there's plenty of reasons to say, don't put it into the charter if we charter, right? Let the working group decide. But what should the charter say? And should we actually charter something now knowing all the relevant things? So Pete.
Pete Resnick, and I shouldn't have to make this caveat, but let me make it perfectly clear. I do work for Qualcomm, but I know Jeremy probably less than some of the other people in the room, and he's outside of my department. I've just been consulting with him, so just to set that up. This is actually a more clarifying question about what you've laid out because I'm missing a piece of information. The fear here, the real problem is if both organizations go off and do something and they end up incompatible. So as I understand it, the authors of the of OTRP in Global Platform are the same as the authors here.
Correct.
Is there some plan or mechanism, I don't know how Global Platform works, to pull OTRP out of Global Platform, or now that it's in there and Global Platform has decided they like it, they could go off and do this whatever we decide to do. And if that's the case, then I don't think we should get anywhere near chartering until we've got agreement with Global Platform about what they're doing, so we can decide what or even if it's possible that they won't do certain things that we want to do.
Okay, so there's actually two implied questions in there. And so one was about what Global Platform's process is, and I will try to see if one of the authors can talk about that, because the authors are also the ones that would prefer, I think, IETF over Global Platform. But the other one is about whether the IETF should actually delay, because the Global Platform's use cases are a subset of the IETF's use cases. And so should we delay discussion on the other use cases until the clarity in the Global Platform is something that I want that's something the IETF community should say. And so if people have comments on that. Kathleen?
Kathleen Moriarty. So I heard one more question in there. Is there separable work from what's being done there that could be done here?
Okay. That's related to the A, B, and ... on this slide. Yeah. So if you have comments on that, let us know. Because if there are things that you think would be out of scope for Global Platform regardless that you think would be good for us to do, then, maybe full speed ahead on that. I don't know. So let's go ahead and listen.
Sorin Fabish, Delhi MC. One of the most important points, because of this conflict of interest of a kind, I think it's to have a common interop. So I think that's one of the things that we decide together, and then that could be different implementations or interpretations, but without a common interop, the split will be much worse. So, and I think that's something that I don't know if you should mention from the beginning in the statement, but I think that's the goal. So.
Joe Hildebrand with my liaison lead. I lead the liaison program at the IAB at the moment. So I've got that happen. If we do end up doing work on both sides, then of course we should consider having a formal liaison in place, and we stand ready to help with that if the community wants that.
Kirsten?
Yeah, Cosmo, in the same direction. I think we should not put ourselves into a position where we are exposed to what could be called bullying by another standards organization. I have absolutely no chips in this particular issue. I have no idea about it, but I think the fact that somebody else comes up and says, we want to do this, is not sufficient reason to stop work on it.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Kyle Rose. So there are two things that are kind of drawing me in different directions on this. So the first is that in the most general case, I would like to see the charter be broader, right? I was the one that was talking before about separating trust establishment from applications.
Thank you, Carl.
Right, and the reason why I said that is that your application may require some properties out of your trusted execution environment that some other application might not, right? So for instance, if your application requires that the runtime memory be secure, which is one of the assumptions that you made on the slides, then you can't use, say, a virtual TPM running on a VM on top of a Xen hypervisor, right?
Correct.
That doesn't qualify as a trusted execution environment from your perspective.
That's correct.
But that may be perfectly sufficient for some applications, right?
Correct.
So in the most general case, because all of these things are really similar to each other, it might be nice to have a general framework. The other bit of tension that going the other direction is that feels that it's way beyond the mandate of the IETF, right? That it may be that that's far more general than what the IETF should be involved in. So I'm curious to know what other people think about that and like just how general it should be, and whether the IETF should be pushing into things that are clearly not internet related. So.
Okay. So would it be useful to get a sense of the room right now? Because, for example, if everybody thinks that we should give up and not do anything, then going through the charter may not be as useful as actually knowing. So would it be useful to have a sense of the room right now as to whether it is useful for the IETF to do some work in this area, for some definition of some work? If so, if the answer is yes, then we can talk about what that work might be. Okay, would that be a useful thing? Okay. I see people nodding. Okay, so let's get, if based on what you've heard so far, you believe the IETF should do something in the area of trusted execution environment provisioning, or provisioning of trusted applications. Okay. If you believe that the IETF should do work in this area, please hum now. If you believe that we should not do work in this area, please hum now. That sounds pretty clear. Wow. Okay. If you actually can't tell, hum now. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear. All right, I want to ask you the third way to see if there was a lot of, because remember in the first BOF, 60% would have hummed the other way. I think it was far stronger in the, maybe, 80-20 or something. I wasn't in the middle of the room, so. Okay, 80 in the middle of the room. What's that? 90-10, okay, thank you. All right, so we'll record that. That means it is useful to have charter discussion. Thank you. So at this point, I think it's useful to bring back up the charter text and have people comment on what's in the charter text. Now you know a bunch of the concerns and things, and we can go back to like the auditing question and so on. How much time do we have left?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Is there anything else that we want to do in those 10 minutes besides that that would be useful to you, Kathleen? No? Okay. Otherwise, we'll use the last 10 minutes and actually going through charter editing. Is there any other hums that you want us to do before we run out of time? I can't think of any, but there were some other questions that were raised, maybe split it up, which I've now forgotten. So,
and Kathleen Moriarty, I guess getting more at the scope, right? We formed some scoping questions. Yeah. Editing the charter may or may not get at those questions. So I think if we were to more target these scoping questions.
Yeah, I think there were two comments with respect to the scope of suit versus TEEP.
So hopefully you capture that. So let's switch places. You lead those questions, and I will record over here. Is that okay? Okay. You have questions? Because I can't keep them in my head. I know we talked about them, but.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. Was the hum that we just took about whether the IETF should do something an answer to the question of should we slow down or somehow otherwise synchronize with these other organizations? Are we saying that we're going ahead and,
so you're asking,
then the answer is what are we going to do?
So you're saying there's a different question, which is should we do something now, which is different from the first question. Is that what you're saying?
That, these other organizations have expressed some interest in coordinating or some concern about the IETF doing something in confusing the industry, and it's not clear to me whether we've made a decision about that or not.
Well, and that's a fair point. So I guess if we need to hum, we can take a hum, because the feedback was that them admitting that they want to do work now should not stop us if we believe we should be doing the work as well. And we need to define what that is.
Kathleen Moriarty, so I think we can get at some of that with scoping questions, right? Because if we decide that we want to do work that's completely separable from what they're doing, then that gets at your question, right? So.
So the A, B, and ... on this slide are examples of things that, to my knowledge, have been mentioned on the IETF list, but are not in the proposed protocol document right now, and therefore presumably not in global platform, right? And so ... means in case you think of one that I missed. Actually, I can think of one. Okay, so transport protocol bindings, right? How would I encapsulate OTRP over, COAP or over your protocol of choice, right? That's an example that might be in the A category, right? Because it's just a transport agnostic mechanism right now. Okay, that's the distinction. That's A. B would be how might I scale it down to small devices? Is something that the IETF does for LWIG and things. How do I scale down TLS and so on? There's been some discussion of can I make it work even for class 1 devices, which we might say is out of scope. Maybe that's part of suit. Okay, and then ... The example was an abstract API as opposed to a concrete API is the sort of thing the IETF does do and is not in that document right now too. So maybe an example of a ... is, and so these are examples of things that might be milestones and might affect the scoping part, okay, which are separate from saying the protocol itself, right, which is in the overlap and who should do it, okay? So those might be different hubs, okay? So Joe, you have a question on the question as to how we might phrase questions, I guess is better? No? Okay. Or shall I actually start doing some random hums? Informed random. Okay, Kathleen, do you have any advice? Otherwise,
I just want to listen.
Okay, just want to listen. Okay, so let me break this into a couple things. If you think that the core protocol, and by the core protocol, I'm picking a question that is actually in the overlap area of what GP wants to do and people want the IETF to do, okay? If you believe that we should have that be in scope for a proposed charter, please hum. If you believe it should be out of scope for a proposed charter, please hum. And if you think you can't tell yet, please hum. Okay. All right. Next question. Kathleen, you're in the center. Would you like to report the results?
The strongest was the third.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. If we go through a list of some, is it useful to go through a list of possible things that are not in the overlap area? Would that be useful? Yes? Okay. So let's talk about transport. I only know of 3 right now. Feel free to propose another one. These are examples of things that you might build a scoping thing around. So transport protocol binding. So how you might take something like OTRP and bind it to something that's an actual transport or transfer or whatever protocol between a TAM and a agent that's running in the TEE. Okay. So transport protocol bindings. If you believe the IETF should do work in this area, meaning in scope for the charter, please hum. If you believe we should not, please hum. And if you can't tell yet, please hum. Okay. Kathleen, I know what I heard up here. What did you hear back there?
The first was the strongest, but it wasn't that strong.
Okay. Yep. That's the same as what I heard. Okay.
It's A.
A. Yeah. Okay. The second example that we know of is talking about the IoT use case and perhaps scaling down. So because global platforms work doesn't specifically talk about the IoT use case. Is there stuff that we should do to say how you might tailor IoT to a use case, whether that's informational or not? I'm saying if you think that there's something we should do about how you might scale down to constrained or IoT specific devices, if you think there's something that should be in the charter about that, please hum. If you believe we should not have something like that be in this scope, please hum. And if you can't tell yet, please hum. Okay, I felt that there was a pretty strong for the first one, and not 0 for the other 2, but strong for the first one. Okay, and then the last example that I knew of in the ... was the notion of an abstract versus a concrete API. Right now, the document has a concrete API in there, and the IETF usually doesn't do that, but Global Platform does. Right? Is this something that we might want an abstract API to actually be in scope? If you think the answer is yes, please hum. If you think the answer is no, please hum. And if you can't tell yet, please hum. Okay, it sounded to me like it was about twice as strong for the first one as either of the 2, but it was roughly split. What did you hear from the middle? It was even across. Even across, okay.
That's what I
weighted towards the front of the room, got it.
It projects differently forward from
yeah. But
I kind of heard equal parts as well on this.
What's
one.
that?
To me, it was similar, all 3.
Okay, should we do a show of hands on that one because we had different results in the middle? Okay, if you think that we should have in scope in charter text form about doing abstract API type of things, then please raise your hand. Okay, heavily centered towards the front of the room. Okay, if you believe we should not, please raise your hand. Okay, left side of the room. Okay, and if you believe that you can't tell yet, raise your hand. Okay, randomly about. Okay. So yes, it is correlated with the people who sit in the front of the room. Yes. Okay. Okay. Pete.
So the results were not terribly, this is Pete Resnick again. Yeah. The results were not terribly surprising, but it leads me to another question. You frame these things as things we know are separable, but have we actually gotten something formal from Global Platform saying we're not working on that stuff?
No, what we have is we have
or we just have the messages we've all seen.
So my understanding is the Global Platform community is a fairly small set, and the authors of the spec are in that, and so the representation from the authors is actually a significant percentage of the global community. It is not the leadership of Global Platform, and so they may not be representing the leadership's view, right? Just like we can't necessarily speak on behalf of the IAB or ISG, right? But from the community within GP, we actually have a strong representation here in the room.
So Kathleen Moriarty, so I do think it's important to get the answers to these questions because we have all of you in the room. And so I think just understanding that take before we get the additional input that we need from discussions with Global Platform is just what we're trying to achieve. So thank you.
Okay, so I think we're almost out of time, but I was going to ask how much time
1
we have?
minute.
1 minute. Okay. Are there any other questions that people would find useful to get a sense of the room on? Because this is the time.
Don't need sense of the room, but if anybody wants to volunteer to help with liaison between the two organizations, please send me an email or find somebody, like, give me your name, just so that I can start the process.
Okay. Unless you have any last advice for us, then this is probably a good time to wrap up, right? Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating.
Thanks, everyone. So don't forget blue sheets.
Yes.
If
Make sure
anybody needs to sign.
Anybody still
here?
need blue sheets in the back? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, but some people came in late. Yeah, we circulated them early. Thank you for leading it. I started to take notes while the discussion was going, just to make sure that if we had that.
I feel bad.
What?
Every time I see Soren, like, I'm running. He probably thinks I'm running from him, and I'm not. So.
Yeah, thanks for leading the whole thing. Information, yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's not TEEP. Yeah, no, that's why I was here.
Anything worth bothering happened because I missed the ball? Go directly to something else?
Yeah, we decided it was done, right? Yeah.
Okay.
We're all gonna go work somewhere else.
Did anything important happen?
I thought you asked me significant.
Closing the IETF, like the rumor of Mike Twain's death has been widely reported and, endlessly exaggerated. What were they chatting about? How